Travis Bott is professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Nashotah House Theological Seminary. And today he's going to be delivering a paper titled Servants of the Lord, Theological Anthropology in the Psalms. Welcome, Travis.
Thank you very much. When I was in graduate school, I once confessed to one of my professors that I couldn't seem to bracket out my faith in Jesus Christ while studying the Hebrew Bible. A moment of weakness. He replied, "Well, you won't make a very good biblical scholar." That was a moment of clarity for me. I thought to myself, because I didn't yet have the courage to say it out loud, if that's the case, then so be it. Amen. But at least by God's grace, I'll make a good Christian. So it's a privilege for me to deliver this paper in honor of my teacher, Ray Lubeck, someone who proves that it's possible to be both a good Christian and a good biblical scholar. And in this paper, I'll endeavor out loud to show myself both a Christian and a biblical scholar. How good, I'll leave to you to decide. We live in a world torn by conflicting claims to individual rights. Here are some of the questions we face today. Does a woman have a right to an abortion? Or does the unborn child in her womb have a right to life? You don't have to answer these questions right now. Does a person have a right to marry a same-sex partner? If so, does a baker have a right to refuse to bake a cake for their wedding? Does a man have a right to become a woman? Does he have a right to play women's sports and use a woman's restroom? If so, what about the rights of the biological women who compete with him and want to use the same restroom? Does a person have a right to express religious convictions in public? Or do those convictions need to be kept private in order to not to infringe the rights of another who doesn't share them? Probably didn't think I was going to start off that way. How are traditional Christians to respond? If we eschew quietism, then activism is close at hand. We could campaign to elect certain representatives and judges. We can debate our opponents in favor of certain rights and against others. We could take to the streets to protest loudly and to demonstrate our passion for our causes. I grant that all these responses may do some good in the political sphere, but I fear that they won't convert many to Jesus Christ or convince them to change their moral views. In fact, they will most likely add fuel to the fire and inflame the conflict that already exists in our polarized society. We need to realize that the issues we face are symptoms of a much deeper disease, the contemporary view of humanity. And we need to be reminded that we have in the Psalter a timeless treasure for responding to the anthropological crisis before us. So here's my proposal. We should meditate on the Psalms day and night and invite other people to join us. This may seem like an odd, simplistic, or ineffectual response to today's challenges, but in the rest of this paper, I hope to show why I believe it's so crucial. The historian Carl Trueman has recently written two noteworthy books. In 2020, he published The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and last year he followed it with Strange New World, a more accessible version of the same thesis. In both books, Trueman argues that the current sexual revolution is driven by what he calls expressive individualism, the belief that each individual has a self, a unique core of feelings and intuitions that must be unfolded to express that person's true humanity. He also characterizes this strange new world as a culture of authenticity that celebrates the individual's quest for self-expression. His description helps to explain a couple of things for us. First, it explains the rampant emotivism of our culture. The more strongly someone feels something, the more true it is believed to be. Also, it explains why people can't seem to disagree with tradition Christian morality. Can't seem to agree to disagree. By denying that people should act on their desires, Christianity is thought to deny the basic human rights of the individual. Seen through a cultural lens, then, that's not just mistaken, it's wicked. According to Truman, expressive individualism did not arise with the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Rather, it developed over a much longer period of time, beginning hundreds of years ago. His historical narrative describes how the self was progressively psychologized, politicized, and sexualized by thinkers such as Descartes, Rousseau, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. These developments have contributed to what I call the anthropology of the sovereign self. Human nature is neither given by God nor determined by society. Rather, the self is thought to possess ultimate power by right. Although most people have not read these philosophers, their views of humanity are nevertheless very common today. But how is this possible? Philosopher Charles Taylor's concept of the social imaginary helps to explain. The social imaginary is the shared way that ordinary people imagine their social world and act within it. The ideas of these philosophers have deeply influenced education, books, movies, internet media, that have in turn influenced everyone, Christians and non-Christians alike. Everyone has a sovereign self today. Of course, some still hold traditional moral views, but unless our social imaginary changes, it's only a matter of time until our morality changes as well. What can we do about this? Truman suggests, but does not develop, the idea that the Psalms have an important role to play. Quote, "It's no coincidence that the Psalter is a book of corporate praise. Singing poetry as a community shaped the social imaginary of the Jews, and the church needs to do the same today," end quote. So rather than thinking of worship as a chance to perform for God or each other, we need the Psalms to reform our social imaginary. In the early 20th century, the theologian Karl Barth delivered a lecture that later became an essay entitled "The Strange New World Within the Bible." Truman calls our current cultural environment a strange new world. But Barth uses this phrase quite differently. Although as modern people we tend to believe that the Bible's world is old and our world is the new one, Barth reverses the polarity. The present world is actually the old one, and the biblical world is the new one, coming into being. Opening the Bible, then, is opening a door into the foreign world of God. Since, as Truman has shown, expressive individualism has long influenced our social imaginary, perhaps on second thought, this strange new world is really just the same old world. A stranger, newer world awaits us in the Bible, in the Psalms, where the true God reveals what it means to be truly human. The Psalms of ancient Israel are preserved and presented to us in the Psalter that exhibits what biblical scholar Brevard Childs calls canonical shaping. Psalms 1 and 2 form an introduction to the Psalter as a whole. The Psalter is then divided into 5 books by 4 concluding doxologies. And the entire Psalter comes to a glorious culmination with 5 hymns of praise that echo its 5-fold division. With its opening description of the Blessed One, Psalm 1 offers us a key that unlocks the proper use of the Psalms in the community of faith, but only if we understand it properly. Verse 2 reads, "His delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." ESV representative of many English translations. But there are 2 unfortunate things about this translation. The law of the Lord, the translation of the law of the Lord. First, it encourages us to think narrowly of legal restriction. And second, it sends us to look elsewhere to find it, say to the commandments of Sinai in the Pentateuch. But the word Torah is better translated more broadly as teaching or instruction. And if it is, then we can look to the Psalter itself with its 5-book division as the Pentateuch of divine instruction in view. The Psalter itself is the teaching in which we're to delight and on which we're to meditate day and night. The canonical shape of the Psalter gathers up all the Psalms' human words to and about God and gives them back to us again as God's word about himself and about us. Therefore, we're justified in looking for a normative vision of what it means to be human in the Psalms. The anthropology of the Psalter is, first of all, a theological anthropology. Therefore, before asking what is a human, it's necessary for us to ask, who is God? And the short answer to that question is, God is the King. This God is not a distant deity or an abstraction. He is the Lord of Lords. Adonai ha-Adonim. The one ruler with power and authority above all others. In addition, he is my Lord, Adonai. That is a relational God who lays claim to me personally as I speak the Psalms. However, the imagery of divine kingship isn't limited to God's titles. It appears prominently at the beginning, near the middle, and at the end of the Psalter. So there are many different places we could look in the Psalter and develop this in great detail, but I'm just choosing these as strategic points in the Psalter. Psalm 2, the second half of the Psalter's twofold introduction, sets forth a hierarchical worldview as the backdrop of the Davidic covenant of 2 Samuel 7. Enthroned in heaven, God has established his anointed king on Mount Zion, above his people and all the kings and nations of the earth. The drama of the psalm plays out through 3 quoted speeches. First, the rebellious rulers of the earth express their plan to throw off the dominion of the Lord and his anointed. Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Next, God laughs and assures them that their revolt will fail because he has firmly established his anointed. As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Finally, the anointed recounts his relationship with God and God's promise to give him all the kingdoms of the earth. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations as your heritage. The psalm ends with a warning to the rulers of the earth to serve the Lord and do homage to his son. Those who oppose him will perish, but those who trust in him will be blessed. Near the beginning of the 4th book of the Psalter, Psalms 93 through 100, often called enthronement psalms, repeat the affirmation, the Lord reigns, Adonai Malach. And they acclaim God as King, HaMelech. Here, God's sovereign rule is depicted in 3 ways. First, God's kingship is based on his creation of the world. And I'm going to intersperse quotations from these psalms to just give you a sampling of the language of the psalms themselves. So watch for these quotations. Here's one. The world is established. It shall never be moved. Your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. Second, God's kingship is expressed in just judgment and law-giving. Rise up, O judge of the earth. Repay to the proud what they deserve. Blessed is the man whom you discipline, O Lord, and whom you teach out of your law. Third, God's kingship should evoke praise from all of his creatures. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. All are invited to join in the song of God's kingdom. The final doxology of the Psalter is an entire psalm, Psalm 145, that returns to the image of divine kingship. I will extol you, my God and my King, and bless your name forever and ever. This psalm is an alphabetic acrostic poem with a concentric structure. The center exalts God's eternal kingdom. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures through all generations. The inner ring extols God's gracious care for all his creatures. The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is over all that he has made. Finally, the outer ring encompasses the whole psalm in universal worship. My mouth will speak the praise of the Lord, and let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. praise begins with the acknowledgement of God's gracious kingship and ripples outward to fill the world, continuing through the last 5 Psalms of the Psalter. If God is the king, then what does that make us? What does it make humans? The Psalter's theology leads to its anthropology. Humans are servants of the Lord, Avdei Adonai. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. Instead of a self, the individual has a soul, a nephesh. Or better yet, the individual is a soul, a psychosomatic unity of body and spirit created to serve God. Gladden the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, do I lift up my soul. Various human leaders are called God's servants, such as Abraham, Moses, David, and the priests. God's angelic hosts are referred to as obedient ministers. Bless the Lord, all his hosts, his ministers who do his will. All God's people are servants. Behold, as the eyes of servants look to the hand of their master, so our eyes look to the Lord our God till he has mercy upon us. Indeed, all of God's creatures are his servants. By your appointment they stand this day. All things are your servants. Psalm 119:91. The nations do not yet serve God, but they are urged to bow before him in service. As Psalm 2 says, now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Rejoice with trembling. The human soul receives its identity as a member of God's royal hierarchy, a great body of faithful and some rebellious servants. What does it mean to serve the Lord in the Psalter? If we had more time and space, we could tease out many nuances. But above all, human roles of service correspond to the 3 themes of divine rule that I've already identified. As our King, God is our creator, our lawgiver, and our object of praise. Therefore, human service means honoring God as our maker, obeying his commands, and representing him to those who do not yet serve him. These are the fitting roles of the human servant in the Psalms. But why then do we so long to rule? Psalm 8 makes it clear that this desire is not wrong in itself. The sovereign self is a perversion of our created purpose. Human service also involves exercising dominion over creation. Like Psalm 2, Psalm 8 pictures God at the top of a cosmic hierarchy. God is enthroned on high. Above the heavens and the earth he is made. Unlike Psalm 2, however, Psalm 8 fills out this picture with the creation of humanity in the divine image from Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28. God made humans a little lower than the divine beings. One interpretation of Elohim there. Crowning them with glory and honor and giving them dominion over the animals. Therefore, humans occupy a special place in the world. We're servant kings. Rather than a right, we have a God-given responsibility to rule over the other creatures. But we must not rule in selfish and oppressive ways, for we too are servants of the Lord. I'm sure that most of us here today already have a deep appreciation for the Psalms as Holy Scripture. But I hope that this paper will give us a new sense of why we so desperately need them today. And I hope this paper will also provide fresh impetus for us to begin meditating on the Psalms regularly, even daily, perhaps even using the a lectionary or reading plan, such as the daily office in the Book of Common Prayer. A little plug there. I have shown that current debates over issues like abortion, same-sex unions, and transgenderism are symptoms of an underlying condition, the anthropology of the sovereign self. This isn't a new way of thinking. What seems to us like a strange new world is really just the same old world that Truman has shown developing over hundreds of years. After philosophers disconnected humanity from its transcendent source in God, they psychologized, politicized, and sexualized the self. The sovereign self is now deeply embedded in our social imaginary. That's why it's so difficult to convince people to change their moral views with rational arguments. That's also why the current sexual revolution sees traditional Christian morality as an enemy that stands in the way of human flourishing. Even Christians are native of this conceptual world. But in the words of Bott, there's a strange new world waiting for us in the Psalter. Finally, I hope that this paper will embolden us to invite others, Christian or not yet, to join us as we abide together in the Psalms. In his recent book, The Invitation, A Theology of Evangelism, missiologist Richard Osmer has argued that invitation is the best model for evangelism in our postmodern context. On the one hand, the older approach of conversion through rational argument has now become offensive to those outside the church. On the other hand, the newer approach of hospitality accommodates too much to the culture, undermining the integrity of the gospel. In contrast, the invitational model both maintains the distinctiveness of Christianity and also encourages those outside the church to enter into a communal experience before granting assent to a set of beliefs and practices. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. The Psalms don't directly address the controversial issues of our day, but I would argue they contain the social imaginary or worldview that is necessary for addressing them. The antidote, if you will, for the disease that underlies the conditions we see. In fact, perhaps it is precisely their oblique approach that is needed to entice the sovereign self. The Psalms are invitatory. They invite us to behold God as our King, who lovingly rules his creation, judges justly, and welcomes all in worship. O come, let us sing unto the Lord. They also invite us to see ourselves as God's servant rulers, who exercise dominion by honoring, obeying, and representing our Creator. It is he who has made us, and we are his. If our friends, neighbors, and even enemies accept our invitation to join us in reading and praying the Psalms, then they will enter a strange new world, a world in which they will begin to relearn what it means to be human, and ultimately they will be led to the truly human one, our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Travis. You've given us a lot to think about, and we have some questions here for you. So just starting with the ones we have at the top. Can you talk more about the term nephesh, which you mentioned, and how we should understand it? You mentioned two parts of it, so can you flesh that out a little?
Well, nephesh is often translated soul, and though it seems to mean life, the life of a person, the vital, strength of a person, and it's used interchangeably with the speaker, the psalmist and speaker, and so that's why I think it's a line from Hans Walter Wolff who says the soul, the person is the soul, or something like that. So it's basically this idea that though there are these two parts to humans, the body and the spirit, that they're really not separable from each other, that there's a psychosomatic unity, I think is the term that I used. There's a lot more maybe to say about that, but that's kind of what I was suggesting with that.
No, that's great. Thank you. Next question. How do the Psalms written in anger apply to the sovereign self?
That's good. That's a good question. If some of you probably know that if you look at genre categories, the majority of the Psalms are Psalms of lament, which is perhaps surprising. But if you follow the sweep of the Psalter from beginning to end, what you have is over the course of the Psalter, the Psalms of lament are reducing and the Psalms of praise and thanksgiving are increasing. So there's actually a movement, an arc from beginning to end. And so what I take from that is that anger, among many other emotions, is part of the human experience. And that though when we enter into this movement of prayer and relationship with God, even though we might be in the darkness like Psalm 88 and we can't see the light yet, there is a light that comes from God, and we're in that movement. We are moving toward God's salvation and God's praise. So was the question, how does it relate to what I'm talking about, the kingdom and so forth? Self. I mean, I think one way to relate it is that this kingdom has not yet fully come in this world that we live in. And so this is, of necessity, it's a time of lamenting as well as a time of praising and asking for things to be made right. Mm-hmm. And within the context of the Psalter, I think that's understood within this kingdom concept.
Okay, thank you. Next question. If the Psalms are Christological, what can we learn about the anthropology of the Messiah from the Psalms?
That's a good question. Yeah, so, if you look up New Testament references to these Psalms, of course, you'll find Psalm 2, one that I was talking about, is interpreted of Christ, and Psalm 8, also interpreted of Christ. So I think that one of the problems with Christological interpretation, and many others, but one of the problems with some Christological interpretations is that they've downplayed the anthropological aspect of that, that it just applies to Jesus and not to us. So what we need to think of Christ as not only the king, but he is our Adam, our new human model. And so he's showing us what it means to be truly human. So that's trying to add that back in, the anthropological dimension of that. So I'm very happy as I end on that note that that's where we are going with this as Christians.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more. How do you understand the distinction between a missions framework of hospitality versus invitation?
Obviously, it's the difference between models. Conversion is good, hospitality is good in themselves, but as models of evangelism. So the problem with what we could call a hospitality model is making ourselves different so as to make people feel more comfortable with us. So that's different. That's a model. It actually is a model of evangelism now that's becoming very dominant in some parts of the church. We need to get with the times. We need to change so that people will come to us. But in the process of that, we're subverting our own Christian identity. The core of our faith can be eroded through that. So the difference is, we know who we are. We have our identity, but we're freely inviting people to come and see, to come and taste, to come and experience, to come with us, rather than leading with trying to convince someone of ideas or leading with, hey, I'm really just like you. No, I want to show you something so strange, so mysterious, that you won't even understand. You won't understand what's going on. But let me show you. Let me come and experience it, right? Instead of being afraid of the strangeness of our faith actually embracing that, and that's something that people will be interested in, that will at least, fascinated in some ways, even if they are rejecting it. So that's the model that I'm talking about.
Wonderful. I hope you can all join me in thanking again Travis Bott for all that he shared with us.